Imagine walking into one of the most upscale, high-end luxury stores in the city. The kind of place where everything seems perfect, from the glistening displays to the meticulously curated selection of designer clothes, shoes, and accessories. The scent of expensive cologne lingers in the air, and the faint hum of quiet jazz music fills the background. It's a place where only the most exclusive clientele shop, where you're meant to feel like royalty the moment you step inside. You'd think that everyone who enters would be treated with the utmost respect, right? But what if I told you that in this luxurious world, things aren't always what they seem? What if I told you that in this very store, a young boy was about to face an unjust moment that would shake him to his core, an experience that would lead him to turn the tables in a way no one saw coming? It all starts with a simple visit, a trip to a store that, for many, is a symbol of status and success. For him, it was supposed to be just another day, maybe with a little excitement mixed in, as he browsed around, hoping to find something that caught his eye. But what should have been a pleasant experience quickly turned into a nightmare, and a moment of unjust treatment would set the stage for something far bigger. As the boy stepped into the store, he was greeted with a cold, almost dismissive air. The luxury store manager, with his crisp suit and polished demeanor, barely looked up from his desk. He was too busy with his own world, his own image of superiority watching over the store like a hawk. This wasn't a place for people like him, at least not in the manager's eyes. The boy could feel the subtle judgment in the air. He wasn't wearing the right clothes, the right brand, or perhaps even the right look. It didn't take long for the tension to build. The manager, who was used to the highest-paying customers, took one glance at the boy and immediately assumed something about him. He wasn't even given a chance to express interest in the items on display. Without saying much, the manager simply approached and, in a tone that felt more like an order than a suggestion, told the boy it was best if he left. He didn't want to waste his time dealing with someone who didn't belong in this kind of store. The boy, caught off guard, was humiliated. There were no words of kindness, no explanation, just a clear message that he wasn't welcome. He had only been in the store for a few minutes, barely enough time to even browse, and yet here he was, being kicked out for nothing more than existing. It wasn't just a moment of discomfort, it was an act of blatant discrimination. He was made to feel like his presence didn't matter, like he wasn't worthy of stepping foot into a place that was meant to be an emblem of wealth and elegance. But what the manager didn't know was that this wasn't just another day for the boy. This wasn't just a random visit to a store he could easily forget. No, this was the moment that would ignite a fire inside him, a fire that would change everything. For a while, he stood outside, processing what had just happened. Was it because of his appearance? Was it because of how he looked? Or maybe it was simply because he didn't belong in the manager's mind. It didn't matter. What mattered now was that he couldn't let this slide. He couldn't allow this act of arrogance, of exclusion, to define him. But revenge wouldn't come in the way most people might expect. This wasn't going to be a simple act of retaliation. It wasn't going to be loud or aggressive. It wasn't going to be something the manager could brush off as a random mistake. No, the boy had a plan, a smart, clever plan that would make sure the manager would never forget this day. He wasn't going to play by the rules the manager set. He was going to take matters into his own hands and show him the true power of resilience. As he walked away, he wasn't angry in the way most people might be. He wasn't even sad. He was determined, calm, and focused. There was no rush, no anger clouding his thoughts. Instead, he carefully formulated a strategy, thinking through every move, every detail. He knew this was just the beginning. 2 minutes later, he returned to the store not the way he had left, but with a new sense of purpose. The store manager, still going about his business, had no idea what was coming. The boy's presence wasn't a fluke, it was a carefully calculated move. He walked right back in as if nothing had happened, and immediately, the manager's eyes met his. This time, however, the manager didn't see a young boy who was lost and confused. This time, he saw something else, something he didn't expect, something that was about to turn the tables on everything he thought he knew. What happened next? How did the boy manage to turn the situation around, and what was the ultimate price the manager would have to pay for underestimating him? Would the manager ever get the chance to realize his mistake, or was it already too late? The store, which had seemed so perfect just moments before, now felt like a stage for something much bigger than a simple customer service failure. The tension in the air was palpable, and every move the boy made seemed deliberate, measured. So how exactly did he get his revenge? What was his plan, and how did it all unfold? Well, you'll have to stay tuned for the next part to find out. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. As the boy stood just outside the glass doors of the luxury store, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The world around him buzzed with life, the honking cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the hum of city sounds blending together in a chaotic harmony. But all he could focus on was the sting of humiliation that still burned in his chest. He hadn't even had a chance to speak to the manager, let alone explain why he was there in the first place. All he had received was a glance, a cold dismissal, and then the firm command to leave. And yet, as he stood there, his mind didn't race with anger or frustration. Instead, it was filled with a strange calmness, as if his body had already moved past the hurt and into something far more powerful. It was almost as if the universe had just handed him an opportunity, a chance to flip the script, to prove that he wasn't just a boy who could be brushed aside. He wasn't going to be a nameless face that could be kicked out of a store and forgotten in the blink of an eye. No, he was going to make this moment matter. He glanced up at the store's front window, where the manager was still inside, talking to a well-dressed customer, someone who clearly belonged to the kind of crowd the store catered to. The boy watched, observing the manager's every move, every gesture. He saw how the man spoke with an air of superiority, how he practically preened as he gave the customer his full attention. The arrogance in the manager's posture, the way he believed his position gave him power over others, was undeniable. It was clear that he saw himself as part of an exclusive world, a world that was only for a select few. The boy's eyes narrowed. If the manager thought he was better than everyone else, it was time for him to learn a lesson. But how? The answer didn't come immediately, not in the form of some grand, obvious scheme. Instead, it was small pieces that began to fall into place in his mind, like a puzzle slowly coming together. The first piece was simple: the manager wasn't the only person in the store. There were staff members, other customers, people who were part of this world, but who might also have their own hidden weaknesses. The boy knew that if he could find a way to expose those weaknesses, if he could use the system against itself, he could do more than just get back at the manager. He could turn the whole dynamic upside down. He didn't know how long he stood there, lost in thought, but eventually, a plan began to form. It wasn't a plan born from rage or desperation, it was cold, calculated, and most of all, it was patient. Revenge, he realized, didn't need to be immediate. It didn't need to be loud or dramatic. It just needed to be precise. With a deep breath, he turned away from the store and walked down the sidewalk, his mind already moving forward to the next phase of his plan. He didn't even feel the urge to rush. He knew this wasn't something that could be done impulsively. This had to be executed with the utmost care, with attention to detail. For the next couple of hours, he went about his business, pretending as though the incident had never occurred. He wandered through the city, observing, thinking. He watched the interactions of people in similar stores, in places where appearances meant everything. He noted how the employees treated each customer, how they interacted with the rich and the powerful. He understood now that the store wasn't just selling products, it was selling an image, a status. People weren't buying things here. They were buying access to a world where they could feel important, feel like they were part of something bigger than themselves. And he realized something else, something crucial. The store manager, for all his arrogance, was just a small cog in that system. His power came not from his own abilities, but from the system that had elevated him, from the brand that surrounded him. He wasn't the one who held the true power. The true power was in the customers, in the people who could play the game of status and wealth better than anyone else. That's when it hit him. He didn't need to be like them to take control of the situation. All he needed to do was play the game, but on his own terms. The next day, he returned to the store, his plan now fully formed in his mind. He was dressed differently this time, not in a flashy way, but in a way that made him blend in. He had learned something important over the past day. The luxury world wasn't just about appearance, it was about how you carried yourself. Confidence mattered more than the clothes you wore. And so, he walked back in with his head held high, an air of self-assurance that was completely new to him but felt absolutely right. The manager was still there, his back turned as he spoke to another customer. But the moment the boy entered the store, something shifted in the atmosphere. The staff noticed him right away, and their eyes flicked between him and the manager. The boy wasn't just any customer, there was something different about him this time. He wasn't a threat, but he wasn't someone they could ignore either. The manager, noticing the movement out of the corner of his eye, turned to look at the boy. His gaze locked onto him, but this time, he didn't see a kid who didn't belong. No, this time, he saw someone else, someone with an air of quiet authority that made the manager pause for a fraction of a second. The boy gave him a small, knowing smile, and the manager, caught off guard, hesitated. He cleared his throat and returned to his conversation with the customer, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. That brief moment of hesitation was all the boy needed. He calmly walked toward the most expensive section of the store, taking his time, as if he were a regular customer who belonged in that space. He wasn't in a rush to make a purchase, he was here for something else entirely. As he passed the shelves of luxury watches, high-end bags, and shoes, he couldn't help but notice the subtle change in how the employees were treating him. There was no longer that air of dismissal. Now they were cautious, unsure of how to handle him. But it was the manager's behavior that intrigued him the most. As the boy moved deeper into the store, he could feel the manager's eyes following him, measuring him. The boy could almost hear the man's thoughts, trying to assess whether this was someone he needed to engage with, someone who might make a purchase, or whether he was just wasting time like the countless others he'd ignored before. The boy smiled to himself. The manager was still underestimating him. Still thinking he was just another kid in a sea of faces. But that was about to change. In the meantime, the boy was playing his part, asking questions, handling products, walking around as if he was carefully considering what to buy. He didn't need to buy anything, all he needed to do was get the manager's attention in the right way. But there was one more piece of the puzzle to set in motion. The boy's next move was subtle, but devastating. It would force the manager to make a mistake that would unravel everything. But he had to wait for the perfect moment. Patience was key. And he knew the manager would make that mistake. It was inevitable. The tension in the store was building. The boy could feel it in the air, and he knew the manager could sense it too. He was so close. But before that mistake could happen, something unexpected caught the boy's eye. The manager, as he moved toward the back office, shot the boy one last glance, this time full of judgment. The boy saw the contempt in his eyes, the smugness that said, "You don't belong here." That look would be the manager's undoing. The final piece of the plan had just fallen into place. What the boy had been setting up all this time, what he had carefully prepared, was about to unfold. But it was far more than just a moment of personal satisfaction. It would show the manager and everyone else in that store that no one is beyond reproach. And what the boy was about to do next would leave them all speechless. To be continued. The boy could feel the manager's eyes on him like a heatwave, watching every move he made. It was subtle at first, like the manager was trying to convince himself that he was just another customer, someone who might eventually make a purchase and disappear like the rest. But the tension in the air was unmistakable now. The boy's quiet confidence, the way he carried himself, the deliberate slowness of his movements, it was all starting to get under the manager's skin. The boy moved through the store with a sense of purpose, gliding between the high-end jackets and rows of pristine shoes. He didn't rush, didn't need to. He was letting the silence build. With each step, the manager's unease grew. The boy could almost hear the thoughts running through his head. Who is this kid? What's he after? The boy's eyes stayed focused ahead, but in the corner of his mind, he was already planning the next phase. He needed the manager to make the first move. The last mistake. He couldn't force it, not yet. He had to be patient, let the trap close on its own. As the boy approached the display of luxurious handbags, he noticed a woman nearby, her eyes darting nervously between the boy and the manager. The woman's body language was tight, like someone who knew exactly what was going on but was too afraid to intervene. She was watching the boy, but not with curiosity, more like she was unsure whether to call for help or simply wait for something to happen. The boy's heart skipped a beat. This was the kind of person who could make things explode in an instant. If she got involved, it could ruin everything. The boy's mind raced. He had to deal with this woman quickly, subtly. He wasn't about to let anyone ruin his plan, least of all some well-meaning bystander. He needed her distracted. Without even thinking, he smiled slightly at the woman, giving her a reassuring look that only someone who had been through the motions of being judged could understand. It was almost a silent promise, a way of letting her know that he had everything under control. The look was enough. The woman relaxed just a fraction, easing back against the counter as if she was now less concerned about the boy. But she still lingered, her eyes flicking between him and the manager. It didn't matter. The boy knew how to handle her. Now his attention snapped back to the manager. The man was talking to a different customer, his voice louder now, trying to make up for the attention he had lost. The boy could see it in the way the manager's shoulders were stiff, the way his eyes kept darting over to him. He had been caught off guard earlier, but now he was on edge, trying to regain control of the situation. The boy had succeeded in planting a seed of doubt. It wasn't just about showing up the manager anymore. No, this was about making him feel powerless in his own world. And to do that, he had to take things a step further. He needed something that would push the manager to make a mistake so big that the entire store would feel the ripple effects. The boy walked toward a row of high-end watches. Expensive watches, too expensive for most. Some of the best brands, the kinds of things people spent years working for. The moment he approached the display, the store manager's eyes narrowed, his instincts kicking in. The boy had made his move. He reached for a watch, a classic, sophisticated piece with a glinting gold face, and lifted it in front of his eyes. As he examined the watch carefully, his fingers brushed the price tag. He let out a soft whistle, loud enough for the manager to hear. He wasn't trying to make a scene, no, this was about making the manager think the boy was out of his league. The boy allowed himself to look the watch over for a moment longer than needed, knowing the manager would be watching. From the corner of his eye, he saw the manager stand up straighter. The man's chest puffed out, and the tension in his posture was unmistakable. This was it. The moment had come. The manager approached with that same air of superiority, like he was about to lecture the boy on the value of a product or the importance of being respectful. The boy turned to meet his gaze, the same smile playing at the corners of his lips. The man didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. The weight of his presence was enough. The boy could feel the judgment emanating from him. "You seem interested in that one," the manager finally said, his tone dismissive, almost condescending. "It's quite an investment. Not the kind of thing someone like you would typically buy." The boy's grip on the watch tightened slightly, but he didn't show any sign of anger. He simply nodded slowly, acknowledging the manager's comment without a word. He could see it now. The manager thought the boy was just another outsider, someone who would never be able to afford such luxuries. The arrogance was palpable. Actually, the boy said quietly, I was thinking about getting it. But I'm not sure. The manager's eyebrows shot up, clearly surprised. The boy didn't look like someone who could drop thousands of dollars on a watch. But the boy wasn't finished. He casually turned the watch over in his hand, inspecting the back, pretending to check the engraving. His voice was calm, almost detached. Tell me, he said, keeping his eyes on the watch, do you happen to offer any kind of payment plans? I'm not exactly one to flash around my cash. You know, I'm just a humble guy. The manager froze for a moment, his lips curling into a tight, almost pitying smile. Payment plans? We don't usually offer those for items like this. You see, people who buy this caliber of watch typically. Well, they pay in full, the manager said, his tone a mixture of mockery and thinly veiled disdain. He was trying to remind the boy of his place, to make him feel small in front of the store's elite world. The boy nodded again, but his next move was smooth, effortless. He took a step back from the display, his hand never leaving the watch. With a slight tilt of his head, he looked up at the manager, who stood there, now fully engaged in the conversation, believing he had regained control. Well, that's a shame, the boy said with a shrug. But I guess I'll have to go somewhere else then. Just as the boy turned to leave, the manager's eyes flicked nervously around the store. Something wasn't right. The boy hadn't asked for any kind of help, he hadn't shown any outward sign of frustration. But there was something about his calmness, his casual air of indifference that was starting to unnerve the manager. It was too controlled. Too deliberate. The manager's eyes darted over to the security cameras mounted in the corners of the store, and that's when the boy made his final move. He stepped toward the front of the store, but just as he reached the door, he turned sharply, walking straight toward the woman who had been watching them earlier. Without a word, he pulled his phone from his pocket and opened a recording app. The woman looked up, startled, but the boy just gestured to the manager, who was now pacing nervously near the display. You know, the boy said with a smile, I think you should watch this. It seems like this place isn't so welcoming to all kinds of customers. The woman didn't understand right away, but as the boy held up his phone, the camera focused directly on the manager's tense face. The tension in the room had reached a fever pitch. The store had suddenly become a stage, the boy its unwitting director. The boy could hear the faint buzz of the manager's phone vibrating in his pocket, signaling an incoming message. But the boy was far beyond waiting for the manager to realize what was happening. He had already set the wheels in motion. The manager's mistake was clear. He had underestimated the boy, assumed he didn't belong. And now, it was too late for him to fix it. But what would happen when the video was shared? What would happen when others saw how the manager treated customers, especially when they weren't the right kind of customer? Would it cause a scandal that would bring the store to its knees? Or was there still something more the boy had up his sleeve? The clock was ticking. The tension in the air thickened. But there was still one question left to answer: what exactly would the boy do next? To be continued. As the boy stood by the door, the phone in his hand capturing the nervous tension on the manager's face, a strange feeling crept over him. He hadn't expected it to feel like this, the weight of the moment, the imminent fallout. The manager was pacing now, his face growing more flushed with every step. The boy could sense the shift in the air the moment when the manager realized the power he thought he had was slipping away. But just as the boy thought he had the upper hand, something unexpected happened. A loud, sharp voice echoed from across the room. Is there a problem here? The boy's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the source of the voice. Standing at the front of the store was another figure, tall, well-dressed, with an air of authority that was unmistakable. It was a man, older than the manager, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed power. His presence instantly shifted the mood in the room. The boy had seen him around before, but never up close. This was the store's owner. The owner's eyes scanned the room, lingering first on the boy, then on the manager. There was a brief moment of silence, and in that pause, everything changed. The manager, still caught up in his own frustration, didn't even flinch at the owner's arrival. Instead, he turned toward him, looking almost relieved to have someone to back him up. "Ah, Mr. Lawson, thank God you're here," the manager said, his voice a little too high-pitched, a little too eager. This customer was just customer?" Mr. Lawson interrupted sharply, his gaze still fixed on the boy, but with a hint of recognition. "I don't believe we've met." The boy, still holding his phone, glanced from the manager to Mr. Lawson, trying to gauge the situation. The tension had escalated rapidly. This wasn't just a store manager now. This was the owner, the man who held the keys to the entire operation. The boy had come in with a plan, but now that the owner had arrived, everything felt far more complicated. "No, I guess we haven't," the boy replied evenly, lowering his phone just a fraction. "But I was hoping to make a purchase here today." Mr. Lawson's eyes flicked toward the watch the boy had been holding, then back to the boy's face. There was something calculating in his expression, something cold that sent a shiver down the boy's spine. He was used to being underestimated, but there was something different about the owner. His gaze wasn't just dismissive, it was knowing, almost as if he was aware of exactly what the boy had been up to. "Is that so?" Mr. Lawson said, his voice smooth, but there was an edge to it now. He took a slow step toward the boy, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "And what exactly were you planning on purchasing?" The boy stood his ground, refusing to let the owner's intimidating presence shake him. "The watch," he said, pointing at the display. "But I was just asking about a payment plan. You know, to make sure I don't pay for it all at once." Mr. Lawson's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone who was used to being in control. He glanced briefly at the manager, who was standing off to the side, his face taut with nervousness. Then, his gaze returned to the boy. "A payment plan?" Mr. Lawson repeated. "I think you've misunderstood how things work here, young man. We don't do payment plans for anyone who doesn't meet a certain standard. And frankly, I don't think you're the type of person we serve." The boy's grip on his phone tightened. That line, that dismissive, elitist remark, struck deeper than he expected. But there was something else the way Mr. Lawson had said it, with such finality. It wasn't just a judgment on the boy, it was a confirmation that everything the boy had suspected about this store was true. The luxury brand wasn't about quality or service. It was about status, about maintaining an illusion of exclusivity. And the boy wasn't part of that illusion. But he wasn't about to let Mr. Lawson win this easily. The entire plan was built on exposing the arrogance, the system that kept people like him on the outside. He had to press forward, had to expose the true nature of the store for what it was. Before he could respond, Mr. Lawson turned back to the manager, a look of mild annoyance crossing his face. "Make sure this doesn't escalate. I don't want trouble in my store." His words were sharp, dismissive, as if he was already moving on from the encounter, already preparing for his next deal. The boy stood there for a moment, his pulse racing. He could feel the eyes of the customers around him, the staff, all shifting uneasily between him and the manager. The weight of the situation was suffocating. But then, in that moment of silence, something clicked inside him. The boy glanced down at his phone and realized that, in the midst of all the tension, he had left the camera running. He hadn't turned it off, hadn't stopped recording. And the last few words Mr. Lawson had said, those words about not serving people like him, had been captured in crystal clear audio. His mind raced. He could feel the walls closing in, but suddenly, he had an idea. He wasn't just going to expose the manager now. He was going after the owner too. He was going to show the world what this store was really about. Without saying another word, he stepped back and pressed the button on his phone to stop the recording. His fingers were steady, but his heart was pounding. The next move would be crucial. He glanced around. The woman who had been watching him earlier was still in the corner, her face a mix of confusion and curiosity. She didn't know what to make of the situation, but the boy knew that this was his moment to seize control. He approached the woman slowly, his eyes locked on hers. She gave him a questioning look but didn't move. "I need your help," the boy said quietly, his voice low but urgent. "I just recorded what the owner said. He made a mistake. I have proof." The woman's eyes widened, and for a split second, the boy saw something flicker in her expression, a recognition, maybe even empathy. She hesitated for only a moment, but then her eyes darted toward the manager and Mr. Lawson, who were now talking in hushed tones, still oblivious to the storm that was about to hit them. "Do you know what this could do?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "This could ruin them. This could ruin everything." The boy nodded. "I know. But it's not just about them anymore. It's about showing people the truth. It's about showing that this place isn't what it pretends to be." The woman looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing her options. Finally, she nodded, a subtle but resolute gesture. "I'll help you," she said, her voice determined. "Let's bring them down." And just like that, the boy's plan escalated. The stakes had been raised, and the final confrontation was coming. With the evidence in hand, the boy was about to take the fight to a whole new level. He wasn't just going to expose the store manager's arrogance. He was going to tear down the entire system, the facade of luxury and exclusivity, and show the world what it really stood for. But just as they were preparing to move forward, a sudden, sharp ring of a phone broke the silence. The boy's eyes darted back to the manager, who was holding his phone to his ear, his face going pale as he listened to the voice on the other end. Whatever it wasn't good. The boy's pulse quickened. Something was about to change. And the truth was closer than ever. The tension in the store had reached a boiling point. The boy's heart pounded as he watched the manager speak rapidly into his phone. He could tell by the frantic look on the manager's face that whatever news he was receiving was bad, far worse than the boy had anticipated. His instincts told him this was his moment. Everything he had worked for, everything he had planned, was coming together. But even with the evidence on his phone, even with the woman now standing by his side, the boy knew he had to play it carefully. The manager hung up the phone, his eyes now wide with fear, his hands shaking as he lowered the device. The boy couldn't help but notice the shift in his demeanor. The once confident, almost cocky man was now visibly rattled. The woman beside him shifted nervously, glancing at the boy. "What's going on?" she whispered. "I don't know yet," the boy replied, his voice steady but alert. "But we're about to find out." The manager cleared his throat and looked toward the boy, trying to regain some composure, though it was clear he was failing. This isn't over," he muttered, almost to himself. "We'll have to deal with this now." But before the manager could do anything more, Mr. Lawson, the store owner, turned on his heel and walked back toward them. The moment his gaze landed on the boy, there was a quiet, almost chilling calm in his expression. He had been watching everything unfold from a distance, but now he was making his move. "I think it's time we clear this up, don't you?" Mr. Lawson said, his voice smooth but with a quiet, underlying menace. "I'm not sure who you think you are, but you're making a mistake if you believe this will end well for you." The boy could feel the weight of the words, but he didn't flinch. "I don't make mistakes," he said quietly, his grip on his phone tightening. "I'm just showing people what's really going on here." There was a long pause. Mr. Lawson studied him for a moment, then his lips curled into a smile, but it was cold, calculated. "You think you've got something? You think you've caught us in some kind of lie?" His voice dropped lower. "You're wrong. You're far from the first person to think they could take us down." The boy's eyes narrowed. This wasn't what he had expected. Mr. Lawson's words were confident, but something in his tone made the boy realize that there was more to this situation than he had thought. The manager, standing just behind the owner, was still visibly sweating, but Mr. Lawson seemed completely in control. The woman beside him shifted, her eyes darting nervously. "What do we do?" she whispered again. The boy's mind raced. This wasn't how he had imagined it would go down. He thought the evidence would be enough to expose the store's corruption, to show the arrogance of the staff and the store's elitist practices. But the way Mr. Lawson was speaking like he had everything under control made the boy question everything. Suddenly, the phone in his hand buzzed. The boy glanced down at the screen and froze. His fingers trembled as he saw the name on the incoming message. It was from an unknown number, but the message itself made his stomach drop. "You're being watched. Don't make a scene." He read the words again, his breath catching in his throat. Don't make a scene? Who could be watching him? And how did they know what was going on? Before he could react, the door to the store burst open with a loud clang. The boy turned instinctively, his pulse spiking. There, standing in the doorway, was a man dressed in a crisp black suit, his face covered by a pair of sunglasses, looking every bit as intimidating as Mr. Lawson. The woman gasped quietly beside him, and the boy's stomach churned. This wasn't just some random person. This man carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested he was far more important than any of them. He wasn't just a customer. The new arrival strode toward the front of the store, his presence commanding the room. Mr. Lawson's face shifted instantly. The cold smile disappeared, replaced by something closer to fear. "Mr. Pierce," Mr. Lawson greeted him, but there was no warmth in his tone. The name sounded familiar, but the boy couldn't place it. The man Mr. Pierce removed his sunglasses slowly, scanning the room with an almost predatory gaze. His eyes locked onto the boy for a moment before flicking away. There was a sense of recognition in his expression, but not of surprise, more like he had expected the boy to be here. "I think it's time we had a conversation," Mr. Pierce said, his voice smooth, yet somehow full of threat. "Don't you think?" The boy's mind was spinning. Mr. Lawson was no longer the figure of power in the room. This new man had taken control in an instant, and the boy realized that the game had changed. He wasn't just up against a manager who had a superiority complex. He was facing someone far more dangerous, someone who likely held the real power behind the scenes. "What's going on?" The woman beside him whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "Who is that man?" The boy didn't answer immediately. He couldn't afford to show any fear now. All he knew was that everything had escalated beyond anything he had expected. The stakes were higher than ever. Mr. Pierce turned his attention to the boy, his gaze piercing. "You've done well," he said. "But this isn't your fight to win. You should have walked away." The boy swallowed hard, his heart hammering. "What do you mean?" Mr. Pierce took a step forward, his eyes cold. "You've been looking for the wrong kind of justice. And now, well, now you've caught the attention of people you shouldn't have." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "You should have known that trying to expose a system this entrenched isn't something you can win. Not unless you understand who you're really dealing with." The boy's thoughts raced. He had no idea who this man was, but the fear in Mr. Lawson's eyes told him that Mr. Pierce wasn't just a wealthy businessman, he was someone with connections, someone with influence. He wasn't just playing a game with the boy. He was toying with him, setting up a trap. "What are you going to do?" the boy managed to ask, his voice steady but with a hint of defiance. Mr. Pierce smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I'm going to give you one last chance," he said, his voice low and measured. "You can leave this store and forget everything that happened today. Walk away. Or I can make sure you regret every step you've taken here. Believe me, I can do that. The boy stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, could feel the stakes like a heavy, suffocating blanket over his shoulders. But something inside him refused to back down, refused to let this man intimidate him. You don't scare me, the boy said, his voice unwavering. Mr. Pierce's expression didn't change. He didn't need to say anything else. Instead, he gave a brief nod, and just like that, the tension in the room seemed to snap. The boy's phone buzzed again. This time, when he checked the screen, his heart nearly stopped. There in the message was a link, an unmarked, anonymous URL. He clicked it instinctively. The page loaded quickly. It was a video. The boy watched as the video played, and his blood ran cold. It was a recording of Mr. Pierce, of him standing in the background, watching the boy's every move. You've been playing a dangerous game, the video ended with. But we've been watching you all along. Suddenly, everything clicked. This whole thing wasn't just about exposing a store. It was about much more, about power, control, and manipulation on a level the boy had never imagined. With a shiver, he realized something terrifying: he wasn't the one in control. He never had been. And just like that, the boy understood the most chilling truth of all. The world he was fighting against wasn't one he could ever escape from. It was a game that was far bigger than him. The boy's eyes were fixed on the screen, the words in the video echoing in his mind. We've been watching you all along. His heart was racing, but he couldn't look away. The video was clear: Mr. Pierce, standing there in the background, observing every step of his plan. The realization hit him like a cold wave: this wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a carefully orchestrated trap, designed to make him believe he was exposing something bigger than himself. But in reality, he had walked right into a situation far beyond his control. He could feel the weight of Mr. Pierce's presence behind him, the air thick with tension. The words the man had spoken, "You've done well," sounded less like praise and more like a warning. A warning that no matter how clever he thought he was, he had underestimated the forces at play. The boy's mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to turn this situation to his advantage. But all he could feel was the crushing reality of his mistake. The plan, the video, everything, it had been too simple, too naive. He wasn't going to expose a system of corruption. He was just another pawn in a much larger game, and the only thing he had succeeded in doing was drawing unwanted attention to himself. As Mr. Pierce stepped closer, his footsteps silent against the polished floor, the boy's thoughts shifted. He was caught in a web, but maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to fight back. The boy wasn't just some powerless kid, he had something the others didn't. He had the truth, and though he wasn't in control of the game, the truth was still something that could not be easily erased. You've been following me, the boy said, his voice low but steady. All along. Even before I walked into this store. Mr. Pierce didn't respond immediately. He stood still for a moment, eyes cold and unreadable. There was no hint of fear or even annoyance in his demeanor, just a quiet, controlled calm that made the boy's stomach twist. Then, finally, Mr. Pierce nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. Of course, Mr. Pierce said, his voice smooth, his words deliberate. Did you really think you were the only one who had been paying attention? You've made quite a stir, you know. But you've only seen a small piece of the picture. You're chasing ghosts, kid. The boy clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. He wasn't going to let Mr. Pierce intimidate him, not now, not when he was so close. So this whole thing. This was all just a game to you. You never cared about what was right or wrong. You just wanted to keep things in your control. Mr. Pierce gave a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. Power is about control, my friend. And the sooner you realize that, the better. People like you, like me, we don't live by the same rules. You were never going to win, not here. Not in this game. A sickening realization began to creep over the boy. All his efforts to expose the store's exclusivity, to shine a light on the unfairness and corruption, had been in vain. The system wasn't just strong, it was designed to keep people like him at bay. But he wasn't ready to give up just yet. He had come too far, risked too much, to back down now. "You're wrong," the boy said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. "This isn't just about the store. It's about what people like you do to keep people like me in the dark. You think I'm just some naive kid, but I'm not. I know what you've built here. And I'm going to make sure people know it." Mr. Pierce's smile faltered for the briefest moment, and the boy caught it. That slight shift in expression gave him just enough hope to hold on. Mr. Pierce might control a lot, but he couldn't control the truth. No one could. "I've already won," Mr. Pierce replied, his tone more pointed now. "And when you're gone, no one will remember your little stunt. This store, this brand, it'll go on, just like it always has. People will forget you ever existed." The boy shook his head, more resolute than ever. "You don't get it. People will remember. They'll remember what you did, even if they don't know all the details right away. Because there's one thing you can't control, Pierce. You can't control people's stories. You can't control their voices." Mr. Pierce's expression hardened, but the boy didn't back down. The manager, who had been silently observing, looked between the two men, uncertainty in his eyes. The woman who had been standing beside the boy was still there, her face pale but determined. She had seen something in him, something that perhaps even he hadn't fully realized until now. "You think this is about me?" the boy continued. "It's not. It's about what you represent. The people who are so blinded by their power that they think they can control everything. You can try to intimidate me, try to shut me down, but the truth doesn't go away. It doesn't disappear." There was a long, tense silence. Mr. Pierce's eyes narrowed, as if sizing him up. But the boy felt something change. For the first time in the entire confrontation, Mr. Pierce didn't seem quite as untouchable. The mask was slipping. The woman beside the boy took a slow, deliberate step forward. "He's right," she said quietly. "The truth is out. It's already out." The boy looked at her in surprise, and she nodded, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "You see, Mr. Pierce," she continued, "it's not just the boy who's been paying attention. I have too. I've been documenting everything. Your little game, your manipulation. It's all there." She held up her phone, and Mr. Pierce's gaze flicked to it instantly. The woman had already uploaded the video of the boy's confrontation with the manager, the one that had captured Mr. Lawson's elitist remarks. But that wasn't all. She had also recorded her own interactions with the staff, the way they had belittled customers, the exclusionary practices. And as she showed the video to the boy, he saw something else, the final piece of the puzzle, footage of Mr. Pierce himself, arriving at the store, meeting with the manager, and discussing how to deal with undesirable customers. The pieces of the story were coming together, and with them, the undeniable proof of what they had been up against. Mr. Pierce's face darkened, his jaw clenching. But the boy wasn't afraid anymore. He had done it. He had exposed the corruption. "I told you," the boy said, a sense of triumph in his voice. "People's stories matter. And now, the world will hear them. You can't control everything, Pierce. You can't control the truth." For the first time, there was a flicker of hesitation in Mr. Pierce's eyes. He looked at the video on the woman's phone. And then at the boy, and in that moment, it was as if the mask of invincibility cracked. The room was heavy with the silence of defeat. Mr. Pierce opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it, unable to find the words. The boy took a deep breath, the weight on his chest lifting. It wasn't over yet, but it would be soon. The story was out. The truth had already begun to spread, and there was no going back now. The manager, who had been watching all of this unfold with wide, fearful eyes, took a step back, his posture wilting. He realized, too late, that the boy wasn't the one who had lost. The woman beside the boy looked at him and gave a small, proud smile. "You did it," she said softly. "You really did." The boy nodded, still catching his breath. "It's not just me," he said quietly. "It's about everyone who's been pushed aside. Everyone who's been silenced. We've all been part of this." As Mr. Pierce turned and walked out of the store, his steps heavy, the boy couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about exposing the truth. And in the end, that was something no amount of money or power could take away. In the days that followed, the video spread like wildfire across social media. The story of the boy and his confrontation with the store and Mr. Pierce became a rallying cry for people who had long felt ignored and oppressed by the system. The luxury store, once a symbol of exclusivity and elitism, was now under scrutiny, its practices exposed to the world. The boy had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The system had been shaken, and in the process, the boy had found his voice and helped others find theirs. And as the dust settled, he realized that the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. The truth had its way of spreading. And once it was out there, there was no going back.